What happens when Africans take to the streets for their rights? Recently, thousands of young Kenyans took to the streets to protest against proposed tax increases, and they did not settle until President William Ruto decided in their favor. But why did this happen? What's the story behind these significant events? While the masses made history with their actions, what were their actual demands? Is it a good thing for thousands of people to take to the streets? Let's find out. Kenya stands at a critical juncture as thousands of young Kenyans take to the streets to protest against proposed tax increases. These demonstrations, which have lasted a week, reflect a broader struggle for economic justice and accountability from the administration of President William Ruto. The protests are an example of the vibrant and active civil society that is essential for the progress and development of any nation, particularly in Africa. But what do these protests indicate? In recent years, Kenya has witnessed a surge in youth activism, with young people increasingly taking to the streets to demand economic relief, transparency, and accountability from their leaders. This growing movement reflects a broader trend across the African continent, where the youth are emerging as a powerful force for change. The current protests, sparked by the government's proposed tax hikes, highlight the frustration and disillusionment felt by many young Kenyans who feel that their government has failed to deliver on its promises. One of the most striking features of the current wave of protests is the role of social media in organizing and mobilizing young people. Platforms such as Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram have become essential tools for activists, allowing them to coordinate protests, share information, and document their activities in real time. This digital activism has enabled the youth to bypass traditional media channels, which are often controlled by the state or influenced by corporate interests, and reach a wider audience. The protests began on Tuesday, with thousands of young Kenyans taking to the streets to voice their opposition to the proposed tax increases. These demonstrations were not the result of a single event, but rather a culmination of growing discontent over the government's economic policies. For many young people, social media provides a space to express their frustrations and connect with others who share their concerns. At the heart of the protests is the belief that the government has reneged on its promises to reduce taxes and lower the cost of living. When President William Ruto came to power, he pledged to implement policies that would alleviate the economic burden on ordinary Kenyans. However, many young people feel that these promises have not been fulfilled. Instead, they argue that the government's proposed tax hikes will further exacerbate the financial struggles faced by many families. Kenya's youth unemployment rate is alarmingly high, with many young people unable to find well-paying jobs despite having completed their education. This economic disenfranchisement has fueled frustration and anger, as young Kenyans feel that they are being left behind in their own country. The proposed tax increases, which include levies on essential goods such as bread and mobile services, are seen as an additional burden on a population already struggling to make ends meet. Beyond the immediate economic concerns, the protests are also driven by a broader demand for transparency and accountability from the government. Many young Kenyans believe that corruption and mismanagement are at the root of the country's economic problems. They argue that public funds are being siphoned off by corrupt officials, leaving little for essential services such as education, healthcare, and infrastructure. Hanifa Adan, one of the protest organizers, has been vocal about the need for a public response from President Ruto. He said, "If he truly wants dialogue, he must respond publicly to our demand letter." This demand for a public response highlights the desire for accountability and transparency in government dealings. The protesters are not just calling for economic relief, but also for a fundamental change in the way the country is governed. The demand letter, which has been widely circulated on social media, outlines several key demands, including the immediate rollback of the proposed tax hikes, an independent audit of public finances, and the prosecution of officials found guilty of corruption. By making these demands public, the protesters are putting pressure on the government to take concrete actions rather than offering vague promises. The announcement of a national strike on June 25th highlights the determination and resolve of the protesters. This call for a nationwide shutdown is intended to send a clear message to the government that the youth will not back down until their demands are met. The national strike is expected to involve not only street protests, but also a boycott of work and commercial activities aimed at bringing the country to a standstill. But apart from if the requests were accepted, the question is what impact such a protest will have. In countries like Nigeria, Sudan, and South Africa, young people have been at the forefront of movements calling for social, economic, and political change. These movements are often driven by similar frustrations: high unemployment rates, economic inequality, corruption, and a lack of opportunities. By organizing and mobilizing, Africa's youth are challenging the status quo and pushing for a more just and equitable future. The protests in Kenya, therefore, have implications beyond the country's borders. They signal to other young Africans that it is possible to stand up against oppressive policies and demand change. The success of these protests could inspire similar movements in other parts of the continent, fostering a sense of solidarity and collective action among Africa's youth. The protests indeed got the right response, and Ruto had to take down some taxes. But the question is, what's the problem in its very roots? Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. Many Kenyans view President William Ruto's leadership as increasingly out of touch with the needs and aspirations of the people. Critics argue that his policies are heavily influenced by external interests, particularly international lenders, and that his administration prioritizes these demands over the welfare of ordinary Kenyans. This growing perception has been a significant factor in fueling the protests, as many see a victory against Ruto's policies as a broader win for African sovereignty and self-determination. President Ruto's administration has faced criticism for its economic policies, which many believe fail to address the pressing needs of the Kenyan populace. When Ruto assumed office, he promised to reduce taxes and make the cost of living more affordable for Kenyans, as we already discussed. However, his government's recent proposals to increase taxes on essential goods and services have been seen as a betrayal of these promises. The proposed tax hikes on items such as bread and mobile services disproportionately impact lower-income and middle-class families, exacerbating their financial struggles. The economic challenges facing Kenya are not unique, but many feel that Ruto's administration has not done enough to mitigate their impact on ordinary citizens. The high youth unemployment rate, coupled with the rising cost of living, has left many young Kenyans feeling disenfranchised and disillusioned with their government. Instead of addressing these issues, critics argue that Ruto's policies have deepened the economic divide, leaving the most vulnerable segments of society to bear the brunt of the country's financial woes. A significant point of contention among critics is the influence of external interests on Ruto's policies. Kenya, like many other African nations, has a substantial debt burden, and the government has had to rely on loans from international lenders to finance its budget and development projects. Critics argue that these lenders, including institutions such as the International Monetary Fund (IMF) and the World Bank, exert undue influence on Kenya's economic policies, prioritizing fiscal austerity and debt repayment over social welfare. The perception that Ruto's administration is more concerned with satisfying the conditions set by international lenders than addressing the needs of its citizens has been a key driver of the protests. Many Kenyans believe that the government's focus on meeting external obligations has come at the expense of investing in critical areas such as healthcare, education, and infrastructure. This has led to a growing sentiment that Kenya's sovereignty is being undermined by external forces, and that the country's leaders are acting as puppets to foreign interests. One of the most vocal criticisms of Ruto's leadership is the notion that his administration prioritizes international demands over domestic welfare. The proposed tax hikes, which are intended to fill a significant budget shortfall, are seen as a direct response to pressure from international lenders to increase revenue and reduce the fiscal deficit. However, these measures have been met with widespread opposition, as many believe they will only deepen the economic hardship faced by ordinary Kenyans. The government's decision to roll back some of the proposed tax hikes in response to the protests highlights the tension between meeting international demands and addressing domestic concerns. While the rollback on levies for bread, car ownership, and mobile services was a concession to the protesters, it has left a substantial budget gap that the government plans to fill by increasing fuel prices and export taxes. Critics argue that these measures will only shift the burden to other sectors of the economy, perpetuating a cycle of financial strain for ordinary citizens. The protests against Ruto's policies are not just about opposing specific economic measures. They represent a broader struggle for African sovereignty and self-determination. Many Kenyans view the fight against Ruto's administration as part of a larger battle to reclaim their country's independence from foreign influence and assert their right to determine their economic future. This sentiment resonates deeply across the continent, where many African nations face similar challenges of external debt and economic dependency. By standing up against policies perceived as being dictated by international lenders, the protesters are asserting their desire for a more autonomous and self-reliant Kenya. This struggle for sovereignty is seen as a critical step towards building a more equitable and just society, where the needs of the people are prioritized over the interests of external actors. A victory against Ruto's policies is therefore celebrated not just as a win for the protesters, but as a triumph for African self-determination and independence. Civil society organizations have played a crucial role in articulating the criticisms of Ruto's leadership and mobilizing support for the protests. Groups such as the Kenya Human Rights Commission and Amnesty International have been vocal in highlighting the impact of the government's economic policies on ordinary citizens and calling for greater transparency and accountability. These organizations have also documented instances of police violence and human rights abuses during the protests, further galvanizing public support for the movement. The involvement of civil society highlights the importance of a vibrant and active citizenry in holding leaders accountable and advocating for social justice. By challenging Ruto's policies and advocating for the rights of ordinary Kenyans, these groups are contributing to a broader movement for democratic governance and civic engagement in Kenya. Their efforts are a reminder of the power of collective action and the critical role that civil society plays in shaping the future of African nations. The government's initial response to the protests included rolling back several tax hikes, such as levies on bread, car ownership, and financial and mobile services. However, this has resulted in a significant budget shortfall of 200 billion shillings. To fill this gap, the government plans to increase fuel prices and export taxes, a move that critics argue will further burden ordinary Kenyans already struggling with high inflation. Kenya's economic challenges are exacerbated by a substantial debt burden and the devaluation of the local currency over the past 2 years. These factors have limited President Ruto's options, making tax hikes seem unavoidable. So still, as we mentioned, the things he did in the past make his reputation questionable. Now today, no one is willing to accept if he is deciding with no external influence. But the government must understand what the people of Kenya are going through. They need to consider their emotions. So, how did the government respond to these protests? While the protests in Kenya have largely been peaceful, there have been alarming instances of police violence that underscore the critical need for accountability and respect for human rights. Human rights organizations, including Amnesty International, have reported that at least 105 protesters were arrested during the demonstrations. The authorities' response included the use of tear gas, water cannons, and rubber bullets, raising serious concerns about the excessive use of force against peaceful demonstrators. The use of tear gas, water cannons, and rubber bullets by the police has been widely condemned by human rights organizations. These measures, often deemed necessary to control unruly crowds, have been used indiscriminately against peaceful protesters. The deployment of such forceful tactics has not only escalated tensions, but also caused physical harm and psychological trauma to many participants. One of the most tragic incidents during the protests was the death of 21-year-old Evans Karatu. Karatu was hit by a tear gas canister, resulting in injuries that led to his death in the hospital. His death has become a symbol of the brutality faced by protesters and has intensified calls for justice and accountability. The loss of a young life in such circumstances has galvanized the protesters, who now not only demand economic relief, but also an end to police violence. Human rights organizations have been at the forefront of documenting and condemning the instances of police violence during the protests. Amnesty International, along with other local and international groups, has called for immediate investigations into the actions of the security forces. These organizations have highlighted the disproportionate use of force, and the violation of the protesters' rights to peaceful assembly and freedom of expression. The Kenya Human Rights Commission (KHRC) has also been actively involved in monitoring the protests and reporting incidents of police brutality. KHRC officials have been present at various protest sites, providing first-hand accounts of the violence and assisting those who have been injured or arrested. Their efforts have been crucial in bringing international attention to the human rights abuses occurring in Kenya and pressuring the government to act. However, the death of Evans Karatu has had a profound impact on the protest movement. Karatu, a young man full of potential, became an unintended martyr for the cause. His death has sparked widespread outrage and grief, with many viewing it as a stark illustration of the government's disregard for the lives and rights of its citizens. Vigils and memorials have been held in Karatu's honor, with protesters and community leaders using these gatherings to call for justice and an end to police brutality. The emotional toll of his death has been felt deeply by his family, friends, and the broader community, who are now more determined than ever to seek accountability for his tragic loss. In addition to the death of Evans Karatu, there are ongoing investigations into allegations that a 29-year-old man was shot by police officers in Nairobi following the protests. The Independent Policing Oversight Authority (IPOA), a police watchdog, is conducting a thorough investigation into these allegations. The IPOA's involvement is crucial for ensuring that any wrongdoing by the police is addressed and that justice is served. These investigations are vital for maintaining public trust in the security forces and the rule of law. Transparency and accountability in handling these cases will determine whether the government can restore confidence among its citizens. The outcome of these investigations will also set a precedent for how future instances of police violence are handled, making it imperative that they are conducted with the utmost integrity and impartiality. The instances of police violence during the protests have broader implications for Kenya's democracy and governance. The right to peaceful assembly and protest is a fundamental aspect of a functioning democracy. When these rights are undermined by state violence, it threatens the very foundation of democratic governance and the social contract between the government and its citizens. Moreover, the use of excessive force against peaceful protesters sends a chilling message to those who might wish to exercise their democratic rights in the future. It creates an environment of fear and repression, where citizens are reluctant to speak out against injustices for fear of retaliation. This erosion of democratic space is detrimental to the long-term stability and development of the country. Overall, what do these protests mean for Africa? In these challenging times, the power and potential of Kenya's youth cannot be overstated. Their activism and demands for change reflect a broader generational shift in Africa, where young people are becoming more politically active and socially aware. This demographic, which constitutes a significant portion of the continent's population, is increasingly vocal about their aspirations and discontent with the status quo. The protests in Kenya are a testament to the youth's resilience and their refusal to accept policies that do not align with their vision for the future. By organizing and documenting their protests through social media, young Kenyans have effectively utilized modern tools to mobilize and communicate their message. This tech-savvy approach not only amplifies their voices but also inspires similar movements across Africa. A victory against Ruto's policies has become a significant milestone for the protesters and a broader win for African sovereignty. It would demonstrate that ordinary citizens have the power to influence government policies and demand accountability from their leaders. This outcome would serve as an inspiration for other movements across the continent, reinforcing the importance of active citizenship and collective action. Moreover, a win against policies perceived as being imposed by foreign interests would be a powerful statement of African unity and determination. It would signal a rejection of the neo-colonial practices that continue to undermine the continent's development and a commitment to forging a future defined by African values and priorities. Do you think the protests signal Africa is on the path to success? Does the masses getting active mean a good thing? Let us know in the comments section. Do you believe having power in locals' hands is a good thing? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, And until the next video, stay tuned.